Hi. What I'm about to share with you is a very sad and disturbing reality that existed far before Corona. Sweden's healthcare crisis has been a fact for many, many years. And yet, I'm sitting here in this country seeing how it's amassing this fantastic reputation abroad for our nearly utopian healthcare system. Well, I'm a Swedish citizen, and I'm terrified of becoming seriously ill in this country, because I'm fully aware that if I were to become sick, then the Swedish healthcare could kill me far before any serious illness does. In 2015, a group of doctors and professors warned Sweden that thousands of patients are dying every year just from the healthcare system alone, due to insufficient care and measures being carried out. Fast forward to 2022 and nothing has changed. In fact, it's only getting worse. Just a month ago, our National Emergency Call Center issued an emergency of their own. Anyone calling 911 for an ambulance in Sweden might encounter a 4-minute long waiting line, and the staff is so over-encumbered with calls that employees don't even have time to go to the bathroom or even have lunch. As one operator told Aftonbladet, "It's only a matter of time before our system collapses entirely." End of quote. The media also interviewed a former call operator who had to quit due to the mental pressure, citing a story about a young boy that was choking. While his parents panicked and tried to get whatever the boy swallowed out of his throat, a woman passing by called 911. When the operator picks up, her first question was why it took them 3 minutes to pick up the phone, and by that point the parents had already left in their own car to find help somewhere else. So now neither of them will ever know if that boy survived or choked to death. Due to stories like this, more and more Swedish 911 operators are quitting an already undermanned work sector, and many are now worried that Sweden will soon have a 911 without any staff to operate it. A similar crisis is taking place in a different part of our healthcare, namely the hospitals themselves. In 2017, one of our biggest dailies affirmed that in Sweden, patients are dying just from the waiting time alone. One example they give is how a patient with a heart disease comes in with difficulties breathing. And instead of having the space to put him into the stroke department, they just leave him waiting until he dies. The article states that lack of resources and space is an emergency mode across the entire country, and 1 in 20 patients are mishandled. To give one example of what this might look like, one man died recently solely because he was left waiting too long and the hospital was too crowded with people in the hallways for staff to be able to reach the proper life-saving equipment on time. In another city, a young man died recently because he was left waiting in the emergency so long he developed blood poisoning. 10 hours. A chief doctor is quoted here saying, "Naturally, lack of room and resources putting more strain on staff than they can handle will have consequences." End of quote. Since the year 2000, Sweden's population has increased with 16%, and it's largely due to immigration. We are now 10 million people and counting living in this country, and 30% of those have a foreign background. Of course, it was obvious even 7 years ago when I started this channel and sent out an alarm that a country should mind its infrastructure conservatively and not take in more people than they can handle. That this is a great disservice to both Swedes and migrant Swedes living here alike. But that was simply dismissed as racism with the usual leftist moral panic. Fast forward to today, and I'm now reading headline after headline every single week along the lines of "Pensioner went to emergency room and was put on a hard bed to wait 24 hours for help." A woman went to the emergency with severe stomach pains and waited 17 hours for someone to look at her. A woman passed out by a road and those passing by called 911, only to be told it would take an hour for an ambulance to show up. All because highest taxes in the world, Sweden, had to cut down on ambulances. A woman called 911 numerous times saying she's lost the sensation in her legs and feels like she's gonna faint. They denied her an ambulance several times with several calls, so she was left with no choice but to try and drive to the emergency herself, at which point she ended up dying on the way. A chief doctor later stated the obvious by saying she would have survived if anyone had cared sooner. Just a quick mention before we continue, I'm sure you've missed that my latest video was an Odyssey exclusive upload, so just look in the video description to get a fancy link taking you there. I also made a YouTube video about why I'm gonna have to put some of my videos on other sites now, so in case you missed that as well, just click in the upper right corner card to get a link taking you there. Let's continue. When a person called 911, the ambulance was heavily delayed because the operator started arguing with the ambulance driver. You see, the ambulance driver wanted to go to lunch instead of saving someone's life, at which point he had to start arguing and delay the patient to the help. What's worse is that this scumbag kept his job and was only given a warning because Swedes believe in endless second chances. The entire country of Sweden is seeing longer and longer waiting times with ambulances, and to illustrate the disaster here, here's what the chairman of a heart-lung research council had to say, quote, "If your heart stops suddenly, it is crucial to get quick help. Just a few minutes can be the decisive factor between life and death," end of quote. But this is a piece of logic that can be applied to the broader state of our disastrous healthcare. In 2018, surgeons called an alarm to the public about how patients with colon cancer are forced to wait so long that they become uncurable. And this applies to general health issues as well. For example, a 70-year-old went to the hospital several times with a heart attack, describing symptoms of severe difficulties breathing, pain, and fever. He wasn't taken seriously, and they dismissed it as bronchitis without even giving him a health checkup. So he was sent home over and over again until he died. A young boy had severe headaches for several years. He kept going to the hospital and they kept dismissing him for years until he died of his brain tumor. It took 6 years for them to write him a prescription and find out what was wrong with a deeper checkup. Because until then, they just said it was a migraine and refused to look further into it. A high school student had severe pains and numbing of the face, and it was so bad he would scream from the pain at night, which prompted the family to seek up Swedish healthcare. This was difficult and required numerous attempts because getting appointments took a very long time, and doctors dismissed him by saying he was just anxious, and so all they did was to give him aspirin. It turns out he had aggressive lymphatic cancer, and he died because it took a month for the doctor to even bother sending him to a detailed checkup. I wish I could tell you these stories are rare, but here's a case with a 4-year-old boy who had leukemia and was dismissed by Swedish doctors numerous times. He was just given aspirin and told to go home while they refused to give him any closer checkups. Because I'm guessing that just costs too much money here in the welfare utopia of Sweden. Men with prostate cancer on average have to wait 131 days for surgery, and this is the most common form of cancer in this country. The absolute worst is the southern regions of Sweden, where less than 1 in 4 were given surgery in time. But not a single county in Sweden fulfilled the goal of operating on prostate cancer within 2 months of getting diagnosed. It is so bad that Swedish cancer patients are being sent abroad to receive healthcare, because here in Sweden, we just don't have enough staff, room, and resources to keep bragging. So given all of the horrible articles and cases I've showed you, that are coming straight from our mainstream media and have made the public aware, how do you think that the average Swede is reacting to all of this? Well, they stopped caring. It's not that much of an important issue to the Swedish people anymore. It's actually dropped in priority, according to this highly recent opinion poll on what voters and citizens care about. And it especially became boring to them after COVID, because Swedish people worry more about climate change. Yeah, if it wasn't clear that this entire country suffers from narcissistic culturality disorder by the way they handled immigration and COVID and crime and anything, I really hope it's starting to become clear now. Now, in 2021, I'm seeing this team of doctors call a public alarm, saying that Sweden is cancelling a ton of surgeries and this can be a matter of life and death for patients. But Sweden's been doing this kind of stuff for years, far before COVID. Honestly, I feel like they're just using COVID as an excuse to claim that they can't help hospitals being incompetent, and that might be true for certain other countries that have become overwhelmed all of a sudden, but Sweden was just as bad before COVID even existed. And these are just a few of the cases we'll be covering in today's topic, yet another Swedish crisis. This here being the hospital crisis. I also am going to talk about the police crisis and the crime crisis, the shooting crisis that's been happening lately, in the near future. First, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to my channel if you haven't, as it helps with visibility for my content by sending an algorithmic message to YouTube. Also, make sure to turn on the notification bell with all settings. Make sure to sign up to my newsletter so you'll never have to miss a video, and be informed if something were to happen to my channel. Those who want to support my channel can find links in the video description to Subscribestar or Patreon. All sums are appreciated and help me keep doing this. Look, for only $1 a month, you can brag about adopting a foreigner, which grants you a vaccine against racism. Isn't that grand? It should definitely make your Tinder life easier. Now, a frequently asked question throughout my career has been, how can an immigrant like you be against immigration? Because I don't want to become a refugee again. For a second time. Wasn't that obvious? I mean, right now, I'm living in a country where I'm afraid to get sick, because it means I might have to go to the hospital and face the risk of being mistreated due to overpopulation. Sweden has the absolute longest waiting lines in Europe when it comes to healthcare. They're worse than Serbia. And this article was published in 2013, for Christ's sake. Here's another one from 2018, and here's one from 2007, just in case you were wondering if this is a pattern yet. You're making a Bosnian Muslim want to go to Serbia for healthcare. Can we just take a moment to appreciate the scope of your failure here? That's a word few people understand, for that matter: overpopulation. I mean, yeah, geographically speaking, Sweden has more space for people, but were you thinking that refugees are gonna live like wild moose out in the woods, where there's no building? Were you hoping to create a whole new generation of mankind called refugee wolf families that get brought up in the wild? If not, I suggest that you pick up a dictionary and look up a word called infrastructure. What happened here is that Sweden overloaded its infrastructure to the point where there's just too many potential patients per capita for hospitals to be able to keep up. And this is where the already existing cracks in the system become far too clear. Immigration, of course, is not the only factor. Swedish culture seems equally as much to blame. These are a people who worship bureaucracy more than efficiency and freedom, and they generally act like state-worshipping, emotionally constipated robots. So they've put up so many protocols and guidelines telling employees how to think that the system is essentially rendered slug-like and useless just through their pathological fetish for paperwork. Sweden has the most doctors per capita in the West, but they also have the biggest bureaucracy, meaning this is also the country where the doctors spend the least time with their patients. Almost a third of doctor work hours are spent on administration, just sitting around writing reports that nobody's even gonna read. Now, I need you to understand me correctly here. Sweden does have plenty of qualified surgeons, doctors, and so on, generally speaking. But what does that matter when they're both overloaded and overguided? It's not that their education is lacking, it's more that they're hurting due to the Swedish culture lacking common sense. Which I guess ties in with why they thought mass immigration from third world countries would be profitable. Profitable! This also seems to be why doctors in Sweden are generally focused on crossing off as many visits as possible to make the statistics look good, instead of guaranteeing that the patient becomes healthy. Because it's the mindset of a computer, not the mindset of a human being that lacks emotional constipation. If you're a non-Swede who's ever interacted with a Swedish person, well, personally I find it hard to see how this issue isn't related to their cultural mentality. the so-called law of Jante. The people are colder than the weather. I mean, the rules are basically written up here. You can see them on the screen, and it applies to just about anywhere, to anything, in any social setting. If you're gonna be socially incompetent, you're gonna be socially incompetent. And then brag about how your healthcare system is the absolute best one in the world, instead of realizing that people outside of Sweden hate bureaucracy for a reason. Bureaucracy is the oh-so-typical Kafkaesque, unconsciously satirical phenomenon of trying to control everything, only to end up with less control and less efficiency. Because you basically tried making an anxiety disorder your way of life, and your workplace code of conduct. So now, there are certain counties in Sweden where even dental care can require you to wait up until 6 years. And the level of security at Swedish hospitals and Swedish psych wards is so bad that a woman with anorexia was raped because they knowingly put a violent man in the same hospital room as her, because Swedes are so blue-eyed that they never believe anything bad can happen until it actually does. You know, pathological naivety really can't be separated from blatant evil. Oh, let's just give him another chance. I'm sure he didn't mean to do it. Why are you being so negative, angry foreigner? You always have to attribute people the worst of intentions. You're a bigger problem than this limp-dick doctor, aren't you? Swedish mentality in a nutshell. Always give second chances, never demand more from people, and always make yourself so pathologically naive you can equally be construed for mentally challenged. I've seriously been critiqued by a lot of Swedes for not being nicer to our politicians. I've been critiqued for not assuming that they're doing the best they can with a difficult situation, when it's obvious to anyone that didn't shove their head up a suit's ass that this problem has existed forever and it's not getting better, it's just getting worse. That is not the definition of empathy and effort. I mean, yikes, there's literally an article like this every week now. I've been seeing this go on for years, just sitting here, and it's just as frequent as the gang shootings we've been having. Believe it or not, the Swedish mentality is as big of a problem as the migration policy. And what I mean by that is the Germanic stereotype of a stiff robot who believes in systems and engines and authority more than he believes in humanity. So it makes perfect sense that the Swedes would invent a lot of stuff and create patents and be good at making dance music, but those things are about technology, not the emotional and social aspects of human living. So that also means it doesn't make sense they would be capable of caring about other people, or at least caring about anyone other than yourself. You really want to make sure to stay subscribed and watch my upcoming video on non-existent civil courage in Sweden to really get a deep dive into this mentality here. Now, my professional take as a professional foreigner and the unofficial tour guide of Sweden is that I'd say that the Swedish obsession with the Sweden image neglected the Sweden reality, to the severe point where people are barely even aware about what kind of country they're living in. Or they just don't care because the climate is more important. I mean, as I demonstrated in my cultural documentary, The China of Europe, it becomes evident that the media really isn't the only people in this country acting like hostile Chinese commies every time we have something critical to say about their country. In my experience, a big part of the people have treated me the same as the media has treated me. When you criticize their utopian national image, they just get super offended, because to them, that's like criticizing their personal ego. They really can't separate the state from themselves. This causes a situation where the Sweden reality is always second to the Sweden image, and that's how these problems came to just grow and grow and grow for each year that's passing by, because once again, they care more about the climate. They care more about climate change and some fictional future disaster than the several social crises that are taking place right in front of them, right around them, right now. Please heed this warning and don't be like Sweden. Please share this video and make sure it spreads so that your country doesn't commit the mistake of becoming like our terrifying utopian healthcare. Now I'm gonna have to drink just to cope just to cope with this oof.